Family, I could not be more thrilled to welcome you today to this conversation on the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When we talk about Dr. King, many people stop at his "I Had a Dream" speech. But Dr. King's life and legacy cannot be limited to a small soundbite. He was a fierce advocate for racial and economic justice. Dr. King was a truth teller who believed in civil disobedience and disruption in service of justice. Alongside many others, especially Black women and LGBTQ folks, he led a coordinated movement for civil rights that changed the social and material realities of Black people in the US and impacted the entire world. And while his quotes are often sanitized and simplified, Dr. King spoke courageously and plainly about the ills of white supremacy and the role of those in positions of power and privilege in maintaining or disrupting injustice. When I think of his legacy, I think of the freedom he helped to create and also the understanding of mutuality he brought to so many of us. Dr. King saw our fates as undeniably linked and the responsibility to act in service of justice as a shared one. And I hope that that call of action is something that each and every one of us bring to the table of our lived experience each and every day. Now, without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to my dear colleagues and friends, Jeff Johnson, Chris Atlas, and Andrea De Loney, to hear them talk about how Dr. King's life and work have shaped their worlds. Family, take it away.
Thank you, Maurice. And it's a pleasure to be here today to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King, talk about his legacy, talk about the empowerment that he's given us, not just as a community and as a people, but also the charge that he continues to instill in us as we continue to try to move forward.
I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that there's something powerful about the whole notion of vision and voice. There's this reality that especially those that have any understanding, either spiritually or intellectually, of the Black faith tradition, that there is something called the prophetic voice. And the prophetic voice is just about that. It's about the voice that is connected to the ability to have vision beyond that which exists. And that's so much of what the movement was about, so much of what King represented. And Andrea, I'm curious, as you think about this whole notion of vision and voice, what for you was either from his voice or from his vision something that inspired you personally?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeff, for that question. You know, one of the things that has always been so important to me, and I charge it to my late parents, is the importance of legacy, right? And every year we talk about honoring and celebrating the life and legacy of Dr. King. And I think for someone like myself, you know, I'm a millennial and late 80s baby, and having grown up and experienced so many of the different injustices that we still see today, that we've learned about, that we hear about from the elders in our family, it's so powerful how someone who was also a young professional at the height of the activism and the work that he was doing can really continue to motivate and empower and inspire a generation like myself and even those who are younger than me. You know, we always say history repeats itself, and there's so much that we can learn from those who have come before us. And I think for myself, not only the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that we do here at Warner, things that I've done in the community myself, you know, this work, it gets ugly and it gets messy, but really being able to stay grounded in the work that Dr. King did, and not only Dr. King, but all of those who served alongside him, Whitney M. Young and so many others. It's really, it's a beautiful thing to know that we can always resort back to the work that they, and the bricks that they laid for us, so we can stay encouraged and continue to stay focused, even in those times where it may feel extremely difficult to do so.
Yeah, Chris, build on that, man, because I think Andrea's point about legacy is an important one. And whether we're talking about King understanding that he was part of the legacy of his father and grandfather, of as an intellectual and a quiet genius, clearly understanding the history that he had inherited. I think we talk about King and we talk about our history almost as a distant story. And I'm curious about how those stories, that legacy that Andrea talked about, actually speaks to you in your current work. So you know, the reality of, you know, Andrea talked about DEI and talked about how we have continued to have to break down doors and navigate into rooms that our parents thought unheard of for someone that looked like us to be in. King talked about being judged by the content of your character, but King also represented Black excellence. And so as you think about what the legacy of the movement has been for you in your real work, how do you connect that?
I mean, I think Jeff, to me, legacy is ongoing. And, you know, sometimes when we use the word legacy, we use it in a historical sense and we reference the past, but legacy is just as much the present as it is the past and the future. And I take that with me in terms of the steps and the movements that I want to do each day, so that as I'm moving forward, as I'm trying to not only be a great executive, but a great father, a great human being, that I walk in the path where I can not only do great work, but think about the lessons and the teachings of Dr. King. And, you know, one of the things that always resonated to me in his work was the acts and the sentiment of nonviolence. And particularly given we are in a violent time, we're in a violent world. And to me, in all the many lessons, all the many things that Dr. King has been about, that was something that always resonated with me in terms of to have that strength, have that courage, that even with all the adversity that he faced and that we still face, that we can continue to try to hold true to that message of nonviolence, but education, love, healing as we try to move forward. So those things are instilled in me, and those things I try to walk with as I go about my day to day, not just, you know, as an executive and as I work, but just in my everyday life.
Yeah, Maurice, you said something in the intro that I loved, and you spoke to kind of not only this legacy of nonviolence, but just the reality that King was always more humanist than he was in any kind of box of civil rights or social justice. He literally tried to elevate humanity. But before he was one that in many ways that cast a vision for other people to believe in, I don't know if we often really reiterate during this time how much he was a manifestation of vision. And when I talk to those that I know in the industry, especially young artists or young executives, when I talk to those who I know in business, young executives or CEOs or entrepreneurs, or I talk to young leaders that are civil rights folks, you know, we often forget how young King was, and surrounded by those 2 and 3 times his age, that when he first came up on the scene were like, yo, what's this youngin' doing? Thinking he gonna come up in the spot, either trying to take my spot or in some way, shape, or form lead something. And that's important, I think, in this moment. And so as someone who I've always seen you as someone who is committed to being wiser than your years, but also standing on legacy of the past, to be in these spaces that people have not been in. And I'm curious, as you think about in this moment, the need for young leadership, how King can represent for us, regardless of what industry you're in, or regardless of what you do, how youth is necessary to bring about change.
Absolutely. I think we know that every civil rights movement around the world was initiated by young folks, right? Young people were engaged at the front lines of them. it's critically important to remember that and to reflect on it, because it's easy to reminisce about King and to place him in some box that's not real, right? Again, talking about his age and his where he was at in life. So I'll say it this way. When I think about that and the responsibility that young people have, I think what we need to do is readdress the idea of our responsibility now. What is my responsibility outside of myself to the larger society now, even as a young person? I think that might be what is different and what might be missing in this particular generation, and the need for young leaders. It's bigger than me. My life is bigger than me becoming successful, financially independent, being able to provide for my own immediate family. If King had that very narrow view of just taking care of him, his foe, and no more, right? Then where will we be? Okay. And so I think it's again, stopping and pausing to have these conversations with young folks to say, not only are we depending on you in the future, but we need you now. And we need you thinking about how you're going to impact the world now, more so than yourself. And so I think that is critically important. I don't think we have enough of them on the front lines. But I also think the last part I'll add to that is, for those who are eager and anxious and take up that responsibility, let's not forget how much of a student King was. King was a genius. And he committed himself to his education, to learning, to enlightening himself. So we have a lot of folks then on the other side of that want to be leaders right now, young leaders, but haven't done the preparation necessary to really be on the front line. So I think we need to understand the responsibility that we have as young folks, but then do the homework and the research and the preparation necessary to lead in this time right now. So that's where I'd be at with it.
And I'd love you all to chime in on that, because sometimes I wonder, is it missing or do we miss it? Because there's this notion that the Black community that King came out of was a fundamentally different community than young artists come out of, young intellectuals come out of, young Black business folks come out of. And I'm wondering sometimes, do we miss their voice and their vision for the package that it comes in and the approach that they use? And I mean that with a broad brush, right? Because I think that there are some that haven't committed to excellence, haven't committed to study. But I wonder sometimes, do we miss the root? Because I can't imagine that the elders thought King was sophisticated when he first showed up. I think that they believed he was trained. I mean, you don't go to Morehouse in Boston and Boston University, PhD'd at the age that he was, and not have pedigree. But we all know that in our community, sometimes pedigree is viewed as a detriment if you don't have spirit. So I'm curious, Andrea and Chris, your thoughts about, do you think sometimes we're missing the young kings who have vision and voice, but it's not our vision and voice?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oftentimes I do think we miss it. And I think, a huge part of that is because some generations and at times we stay so wrapped around what was and what used to be that we fail to realize what innovation can exist in and what's being brought to the table today. Now, that's why for me, I learned very early in my career the importance of not only having a mentor who's your senior, who can really coach and inform you of how to navigate the different things that you are interested in pursuing, but also having a mentee that's 5-10 years your junior. And I've been very intentional to nurture that relationship, because as I'm someone who's actively involved in the community and my mentee is as well, really being able to have him pour into me just as much, if not more, than like how I'm pouring into him, and understanding why his generation is approaching voter education or voting rights the way they're approaching it versus how my generation did at the time. And I think it's important that we continue to create space for that to happen, regardless of what the issue is, regardless of what status a person sits at, because we're a very complex community, right? We're not monolithic. We all come with different experiences that have really molded us to approach these things how we do today. but it's important to not forget how we once were and what was important to us at the time, and really being able to have those conversations, whether you're in the boardroom or you're on the block. And so I think it's important that we always keep that in mind, especially when we're talking about how do we advance our own communities.
I love that. I think it's interesting because as an Xer, some of my Xer colleagues get upset with me because I often have more millennial friends than I do Xers, because I just think Xers think too much like baby boomers sometimes. And I have mentors who are younger than me, because mentorship isn't about age, it's about wisdom. And so I really love that you said that, because I think there's an opportunity for each of us as we think about the vision that we're seeing from some of these young people and the voice, sometimes the fearless voice that they have, that sometimes we need to take a second and say, let me sit under them in some of these areas. And in other areas, I have wisdom to give to them. So I really appreciate you talking about that.
Hey, Jeff, that was a good question. That was a great reframe with that question too, coming back, because I think my own bias, we think that wisdom, knowledge, leadership is packaged a certain way. And I think I have a bias of what that might look like, what that might sound like. That's actually good.
Well, I didn't want to call you a Black elitist.
We should capture this. We should have captured. They should have seen me, because it's true. It was exactly what it was. I was like, he's so right, because if it's not packaged this way, if we don't think of it this way, then we dismiss it. And it's like, you're right. King did not, those folks didn't look at him like who he was at the end of his life when he first hit the scene. They're like, what is this kid doing? That's so good, man. That was good.
And the dope thing about it is, I think music and entertainment has helped us with that. If we've paid attention, right? I mean, and I mean universally, when I think about what NWA actually was, like the complexity of some of the stuff they played that scared the hell out of me, like especially at this age, when I listen to Killer Hooker, I'm like, yo, man, this hurts. Like, I don't want to hear this. But then when I listen to Niggas for Life, I hear the social commentary that exists with it and the pain that exists with it, and think about the music that was being played at that time. And then think about Dope Man, where you got a leading hip hop group that's actually talking about not doing drugs. That there was so much propheticness in their music. And then you bridge that gap across, whether you're talking about Scarface, or whether you're talking about Outkast, or whether you're talking about Kendrick, or whether you're talking about this multitude of men and women, really came with a prophetic but more complex package that didn't have to be, I'm the conscious dude, or I'm the gangster dude, or I'm this. But there's just been this level of complexity in our art.
Yeah.
I don't think we've always seen as leadership.
Nope.
Because we keep looking for it to come out of the church, or we keep looking for it to come out of an established institution. And while King came out of the church, he still hadn't kissed enough rings yet for elders to view him as an acceptable leader.
Right.
Because he wasn't being introduced by these guys. He was almost there in spite of them. And so I think that's often how leadership comes. I mean, for those of us that, no matter where you look, I mean, that was what the Panthers were. That was in many cases what SNCC was. And you think about King in particular with Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture. You know, King could have destroyed Kwame Ture. I mean, Stokely Carmichael. He understood that this was a chess game we were playing. His vision enabled him to understand we're playing chess, not checkers. So I don't need every young leader to sound like me. And while I think Stokely is more aggressive, and in some cases is inciting something that is not nonviolence, I need them on the chessboard.
You do.
And so I validate Stokely.
That's great.
Even as I critique Stokely.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right.
That's when you know somebody's an elder.
Right. Right.
Elder, my job is not to make Stokely and Snick what they should be. My job is to ensure that they are empowered and that they add value to the broader movement. Wow. And so that's why, I mean, I really appreciate that you said it's missing, because that gave us an opportunity to talk about, it ain't really missing. Chris, as we think about King, and again, kind of pushing through these doors as a young leader, attempting to really create impact. I mean, most people heard about King for the first time during the Montgomery bus boycott. And that was where, he started to gain national attention versus just attention in Georgia and in the South. As you think about kind of what vision needs to be lifted in this moment, what you're hearing from people, or even what you're thinking, what's the kind of vision that you believe in this moment? As you talked about the times that we're in and the violent times that we're in, what are the voices of peace, or the visions of peace, the visions of community, the voices of love that you're either seeing or that you want to see? Not just in remembrance of King, but in response to what we need in this moment.
I mean, that's an excellent question, Jeff. And I think it goes back to your previous question in terms of, are we missing? And is it missed, or are we missing it? And I think in many respects, we're missing it. And I think part of that is relative to this current generation. They speak in a different language. They are going through different struggles, different pressures, different anxieties than even we were facing. And as a I guess an elder executive at this point, it's always common to say, "Oh, when I was coming up, we did it this way and we did it that way," and you kids nowadays, which to your point in terms of the value of having younger mentors and mentees helps that balance of the conversation. And I say that to say, where the pressures that I think we currently see in today's youth, it's important that we support and amplify the good things that today's youth are doing, so that they feel incentivized, they feel motivated they feel empowered to continue to speak in their own voice, to continue to challenge themselves and break those barriers. And in many instances, I think we see some of that in music, we see that in art, we see that reflective in terms of just sexuality and ethnicity that's coming to light in a larger degree of acceptance, social acceptance, that we still got work to do, of course, but the conversations are being had. So to me, I think part of continuing to support the arts, continuing to hear and be open to the conversations and the struggles and the challenges that young people are expressing that they're dealing with, is a way for us to continue to not only help ourselves, but help them move forward in terms of work life, family life, socioeconomic pressures. Like, the next 20 years are going to be very different than the past 20 years. And I think that as a culture, we have to prepare for that. And we need to have the tough conversations that help us all prepare for what's gonna happen next. We've all, for the last 2 years, and we were talking about this casually, we've been living in a pandemic that has changed our world forever. And we'll probably see the ripple effects of the past 2 years for the next 20 years, the next 40 years. How are we adjusting to that? How are we taking the learnings of Dr. King and moving that into how we move forward?
I want to dig into one of the things that you said, and thank you for that, is this whole notion of arts and music. And there was a undeniable connectivity to not only the movement, but King in particular and music. I mean, anybody that is familiar with King knows the connection that Mahalia Jackson had to him, knows the connection that Aretha Franklin had to him. And not just as part of the church, but as part of integrating the church into the movement. We're clear that the March on Washington had not only gospel artists, but you had Peter, Paul, and Mary, you had Harry Belafonte, you had almost this breadth and depth of creatives that were part of, and I think that's even interesting, right? Because I don't know if it's even fair to say they were part of leadership in the movement. Some of them created movement songs, but they were followers. They understood that King, that Baynard Rustin, that Fannie Lou Hamer, that these organizations were providing strategy and construct and direction, and they were followers in that. I'll never forget Sonia Sanchez when Sonia Sanchez talked, the great poet, talked a lot about how much she followed Malcolm, and she wasn't a Muslim. She heard him speak in New York, and he spoke to her spirit, and she followed him. She cared for him. She recognized that while my art may have movement tenets to it, there is a movement that I'm following. And so there wasn't this same kind of artist deification that we've seen in probably the last 2 decades, where the young people and not so young people that want to see movements are waiting for artists to lead. I'll never forget being on the set of BET and listening to artists all the time talk about, well, who are the young people I can follow? What are the organizations I can be a part of? Where can I learn this? Because being an artist didn't make you a leader. Going through human evolution, personal evolution made you a leader, no matter what your profession was. And so I'm curious, as you all think about this moment, what art is inspiring you? And I don't mean from the standpoint that they're leaders. I mean from the standpoint, Chris, almost to your point, that they're creating art. They're creating vision that may inspire the next voice.
For me, I think music is always inspiring, right? And some of the current artists that of today's generation that I was really motivated in terms of some of the art and songs they did, particularly in the past couple of years as it relates to George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. Little Baby, Keedron Bryant, Corday, again, Anderson .Paak. Like there's so many of the young musicians that I feel like in the past couple years especially heard the call, heard the pain, heard the struggle, and know that their voice, their music not only is a sense of motivation, but a sense of healing, and the power that they have provides that outlet to motivate others, whether it's other musicians, whether it's other artists, whether it's just giving the platform a larger voice through their music in terms of amplification. And I think that's a key word for me, is like the struggle, the journey, the pain. How are we amplifying it to that large degree where it can actually encourage and enforce change? And I think that call to action is still out there, because we're still seeing every day these senseless killings that are happening. And it becomes hard at times to not be desensitized to it, because you want to keep fighting, you want to keep having those conversations, you want to keep moving forward. So I think it's important that whether we aligned and we used music as that conduit to help find that motivation and inspiration, that we support these artists that are not afraid to actually, tell that story.
And they're all over the place. I mean, I remember during the last presidential cycle, this kid out of Dayton, Yellow Pain, came out of nowhere and almost did like this whole civics lesson that was just honest and raw, and overnight, went viral as a result of it, because the elders had been saying those very same messages over and over and over and over again, just not with the voice of an honest young person. And I mean, when Nate Parker did this last film about police brutality and about what it meant for a father of a murdered child to put the police on trial, the provocativeness of it and the fearlessness of it, I don't even know if we actually used that piece well enough to have some necessary conversation. And so I'm curious about how courageousness plays into this for you all. Again, and in some cases, Andrea, even more in a corporate way. When you think about the courageousness of those on the front lines during the civil rights movement, I think about one of the things that Maurice said, which I think is very true. We're not training people enough, and you couldn't be at a lunch counter in the civil rights movement if you weren't trained, because psychologically you wouldn't be able to deal with it. And we have a lot of Black, Latino, LGBTQI plus, and white folks who want to be allies that are in corporate positions. You talked about, Chris, wanting to make change, transformation. But what for you all is kind of this moment between being part of a movement by what you say or what you post, and being a part of a movement for what you sacrifice? And that to me was King. King said, I could be a prosperous preacher in Atlanta, Georgia, and do very well, but I'm willing to sacrifice my comfort that others would have what they don't currently have. As you think about that from a corporate perspective, and we think about vision and voice within a corporate perspective, how does that delineation between saying all the right things, hashtagging all the right things, coming up with corporate statements, versus doing the hard work, sacrificing certain things, and really putting yourself on the line in a strategic way to create transformation?
It's a great question, Jeff. Let me chime into that around this courage piece. First, I want to give a shout out to my artist who's doing some great work. You asked that question. I didn't want to say that. Janelle Monet is doing incredible work around this on the front lines as well. And I just wanted to acknowledge that to answer that question about what artist is inspiring me.
Read up the whole Wonderland family, because Michelle and that entire team, I think, is courageous on top of being brilliant. Absolutely.
So to the courage piece, and then where does it, as far as posting, talking about it, as we know with the movement, this movement, there are multiple players in the movement. Everybody is not, we shouldn't be called to the same role. We have to have different players in this movement. Some are on the front lines as far as the marches and outspoken and the front lines of advocacy in that way. Others are in the corporate space. I had to sit down and ask myself a question. I want to answer this question, answer it. I hope it's clear what I'm trying to say is that I asked myself, I knew I was not that type of advocate. I knew I could be one fierce front lines, marching, picketing, that I could do that. It's in me. It's a part of my heritage and history. And then I got into this space as far as being a leader, and I asked myself, well, what is your role now that you're a part of the system? What are you supposed to do as being, because oftentimes when you're a part of it, when you're a corporate executive, you're not viewed as a serious advocate, frankly. Oftentimes when you're a corporate executive, you're viewed as a sanitized version, a watered down token of the work. Let's just call it what it is, or especially my role. So I asked myself, but I said, wait a minute. You need folks doing what they do out there, speaking truth to power in that way on the front lines. We need my brother Al Sharpton, the Jesse Jacksons. We need some more contemporary folks I can start listing. But I am sacrificing internally as well in this role, because I could easily walk away from doing what I do right now, take my gifts and talents in a very different direction, not dealing with the headaches and the stress that come along with the work that I'm advocating for inside the corporate space. There is a personal sacrifice that one takes on to take this role, right? There's a personal sacrifice. What is that sacrifice? You're going to be ridiculed because you're never going to do enough. You're never moving the needle far enough. You're never achieving as much gains as you want. You're going to be ridiculed, and you're going to receive pushback from those who you're pushing against, saying you're doing too much, you're trying to move too fast. There's a personal toll that it takes on you as an individual in this space to stay in this space, to continue to remember that even if I can change 1, 2, 10 people's lived experience in this corporation, it's worth it, right? And it's worth the discomfort that I'm going to experience. So I guess to answer it fully, I'm saying that I had to make up my mind that this was my area of where I would focus at, and that I would sacrifice my own personal comforts. I would sacrifice my own personal pleasures, because I'd be doing a lot of other things, getting a lot more pleasure out of it, using my skills and expertise outside of every day fighting and pushing and speaking truth to power with inside the corporation, sometimes with folks that don't truly ever want to hear it, don't ever want to move, but to be consistent and steadfast in that approach. So I'm saying I made up my mind that it was worth it because it was bigger than me. Because if somebody else didn't sit in these corporate spaces, didn't advocate, didn't kick down these doors, I wouldn't be here, and I have a responsibility to do the same. So I think that's my sacrifice. It looks a little bit different, but that's my sacrifice inside the corporate space.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I love that you, I'm sorry, Jeff. I just wanted to chime in because Maurice, you definitely said a couple of things that resonated with me. And I think in my personal experience growing into diversity, equity, and inclusion as a profession, my evolution was quite different. You know, in my late teens, all the way throughout my 20s, I was that rah-rah microphone in hand, leading North Amityville, Copeg, all of Long Island to different places whenever things weren't going well, in whatever capacity, right? Law enforcement, policy and legislation, et cetera. And for me, it wasn't until I actually received my first invitation to sit down with my local elected officials where I realized that rah-rah mentality wasn't going to move the agenda forward in that setting. You know, it worked outside for everyone who came with the anger and the frustration and the passion, but when it came down to actually having an opportunity to get something that we wanted done, it was time to flip the script and change the language that was being used and change the attitude and the perspective that I was bringing to the conversation. And I think for me, you know, that's a question I always ask myself, am I an activist or an advocate? And a lot of times I'll hashtag corporate activist because there's a way to get things done without always having to come off as the aggressor or coming with the Malcolm X mentality, or, you know, some of the others who are a lot more straightforward and direct in how they wanted to get their message across. And I think too, something that I've often spoken about is being a young Black woman doing diversity work in a corporate environment. There are so many people who, to your point, Maurice, are looking at us like, okay, well, because of, you know, your color and because of what you claim to be or who you claim to be, you now have an obligation, you have a responsibility. And so having to wear bear that, you know, we have an obligation to our organization to push things forward, to break down different things that are embedded in the culture to create that equity for all. But then we also have that responsibility for those who are looking up to us and who are coming up behind us to see, well, how are you navigating these spaces, right? How are you talking about all of the isms? How are you engaging in dialogue with folks who are simply afraid to say the word Black in a conversation? And that can be a lot, you know, it's a lot. And I think that's where the importance of having your tribes, I'm Native American as well, so I always say it's important to have your different tribes in your life, so that way you know who you can go to really get out the authentic responses and feelings that you may be experiencing doing this work in a corporate setting, while also being able to press that refresh button and approach these conversations on a day-to-day basis to push things forward.
But I love that point because there's so much nuance in that, Andrea. You talked about, you know, what it meant to be an activist in the truest sense on the street with a bullhorn, and what it meant to be an advocate, or to some degree, whatever we title it inside. But there's more similarities than we often give credit for. And I think one of the things that always excited me about King, when you think about King's inner circle, you had predominantly men, but very different men. Jesse Jackson Jr. was very different from Andy Young, who was very different from Abernathy, who was very different from, in later years, John Lewis. And they recognized this is chess. So I don't compare the bishop to the knight, and I don't compare the rook to the king. I just want to move the rook right. And I want the knight to be moved in the most sophisticated way. I was the national youth director for the NAACP, and I'll never forget when I first read the Constitution, it said to create and develop an intelligent and militant youth leadership. And I'm like, ain't no way this is right. Like, somebody changed these words. No way intelligent and militant was in the NAACP Constitution. But I recognize, Maurice, you talked about the only way changes were made was by young people scaring the hell out of people enough for senior statesmen and women to be able to negotiate. And I was a Black Student Union president when my dad was a vice president of a university and head of, back then, affirmative action, because there was no DEI yet. And the university, it was the University of Cincinnati. This is all public, so I'm not putting anything out there. They were under dissent decree by the US government for affirmative action hiring issues, and they got audited. And the university's council doctored numbers to show they were in compliance. Well, now, Maurice, you're talking about when you're the executive in this position, he wouldn't sign the document and filed an obstruction suit. Well, this came with serious consequence. He was immediately fired. And 7 years later, his case got kicked back from the United States Supreme Court to the US Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, where he had to settle because the judge hearing the case was a former student of the University of Cincinnati and a former associate of the law firm representing the university, and didn't recuse herself. And so when you talk about even being in these corporate positions, it's those moments that nobody ever normally knows about. And whether it's on the creative side as somebody that's determining what is or is not going to come out in somebody's project, or whether it's on the executive side of how you're going to fund certain things or how you're going to do hiring, it often isn't popular. And I use that really long bridge to say, let's be real. When we talk about King and his vision and voice, so many people stop with "I have a dream." And "I have a dream" was the moment where King's popularity ratings were at its highest. So they were doing popularity studies then. He was at a level of almost 90% favorability. When King died, he was at 40% favorability. Now, what happened? And so when King started talking about his opposition to the Vietnam War, and when King started talking, there's a brilliant NBC interview where King talks about, up until this point, we've been transactional, and that America is now going to have to put money on the table in the tune of billions of dollars. If any of these, he was like, you know, the integration of America's stores benefited white supremacy. because now Black folks are spending dollars in places they weren't spending dollars. He talked about America didn't have to pay anything for the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act. But if you were going to deal with real equity, there was a fiscal cost. And so as we think about the Warners of the world and the Amazons of the world and these large corporations, all of whom made really either strategic or interesting commitments on the other side of George Floyd, where would King be in that? And I'm not asking you all to say literally where King would be, but I'm more asking, what's our role in this moment to help guide the companies that we either have relationships or we're a part of, to embrace the vision and voice of equity in a way that does what you said, Andrea, that helps companies understand this is not about moral imperative or charity. This is about, if you want to be a part of a global economy, equity helps you. Are we hearing that voice and vision enough?
I would say I like that. I like that question. And let's just back up. Let me back up and answer. I don't think we're hearing that voice enough. I think oftentimes that's where the conversation gets uncomfortable, right? It's convenient and comfortable to talk about King and the I Have a Dream, because that now, today in 2022, that is just like second nature, common sense. But I think we have to pause and reflect and remember that when he was saying it, the message that King had at the time that he had, again, outside of the I Have a Dream and everything else he was talking about, economic empowerment, justice, leveling the playing field, it was not popular or comfortable or convenient then. I think that's what the disconnect is as well. Number two, I love what you said. I was doing a little research before we had this conversation. I saw a clip of King talking about during the last stages of his life, talking about how he was tired of marching. He's tired of marching for rights that he should have had, that he had by birth. He was tired of, he started to share his frustration. And he also said, I don't have this martyr complex. I don't want to die young. I don't like this anxiety and pressure that I'm feeling every day. I'm saying all that to say, again, in light of what you're talking about, what he was talking about, he understood economic justice. America has bounced the check, basically, that they wrote for us, right? What are we talking about when we have these moments, we put on these events, and we feel good to talk about I Had a Dream and everybody coming together, and there's, everybody's precious in his sight, red or yellow, black and white. What are we talking about when it comes to economic empowerment? When we start having those conversations in the boardrooms, we're talking about, okay, what percentage of Black music is driving our total revenue? And then let's look at that and ask ourselves, what percentage of Black folks are executives and in leadership, right? How are we, when we start talking about the investments we're making, not only making an investment in that artist, but now what investment are we making in that artist's community, the community which that artist came from, right? When we start having those conversations, Jeff, to your point, it gets tight. It gets tight, right? Because we're talking now true transformation, truly transforming the landscape, because we know the base of that is economic, right? That economic justice. And so I think we need to be more courageous and more direct about that. We're leaning into it in this world. Andrea is a part of that work. Chris is a part of that work with me. I mean, we are squarely focusing on the business imperative around here with that work, that we're just not going to be as profitable. We're not going to be as attractive. We can't retain and recruit top talent if we're not investing in them appropriately. But I think it's still some work to do around that. It still makes people uncomfortable when you start talking about money. When you talk about economic justice, when you start talking about that, people still get really tight. So I think it's still critical. We still need to raise our voices about it. And if we're truly going to live into this, we got to be comfortable being uncomfortable with that conversation, Jeff. But I think you're right, and we have to double down our efforts on it.
I mean, if I could just add to that point as well, that's where I think the corporate responsibility comes into play, because it's never going to be popular. It's not going to be mainstream. And in some respects, it's not profitable, so to speak. But it's our responsibility as execs to continue to push those tough conversations, because that's where we encourage the consistent commitment, not just within our organization, but other organizations that are profitable in many respects off of the industry, off of the culture, off of the music, the fashion, the lifestyle, to put back into those communities and into those artists and into those areas that can encourage, the change that we need to see. And, going back to one of your earlier points, Jeff, about just the empowerment of young people and not missing them, like really encouraging them to, carry that conversation on, because like for Maurice or Andrea or yourself or me to continue to have this, to be the voices carrying that conversation, like there needs to be someone else that's picking it up and bringing it along and adding new points to it that we might not even be thinking about, so that not only does the conversation stay relevant, but it stays heard. Because I mean, we all know, like, everyone has attention deficit disorder at times and can move on quickly. And with social media, it seems like things are moving on even faster. So we got to stay vigilant in terms of the conversations and the topics and our responsibility to push it forward.
Well, and I think too, Chris, that there is some pushback there, right? Because when I think about King, in the end, really focusing on an economic justice platform, like the Poor People's Campaign was really about redefining what growth looked like, not mass philanthropy. So he wasn't saying that America should be a mass pool of philanthropic dollars. He was saying we need to reevaluate what growth looks like. And so when I push back with some of my own clients on the DEI side who say DEI isn't profitable, I'm like, no, that's because you don't understand the market. That's you have an antiquated view of what growth is, and that you have an antiquated vision of your own market share. Because if these things that you do, whether it's from a talent acquisition, development, elevation, inclusion, and even how you're placing, having a diverse governance, help put you in a position to gain greater market share, to put you in a position to have market differentiation, that's tangible ROI. When you start talking about how are you building communities where your spend is not going to the same places that it's been going for the last 50 years, but you're looking at Black and brown CEOs, LGBTQI plus companies, and diversifying your spend. I'm so tired of hearing about corporate diversity. I mean, having a diverse supply chain. I want an equitable supply chain, because that says I recognize, especially where my footprint is, if I'm putting dollars into Black, brown, other businesses in that area, not throwing money away, still competitive prices, I'm also increasing the economic proposition of the cities in which I'm doing business, the regions in which I'm doing business. That's profitable. They're not only economic, but potentially political, which turn into economic benefits from that, right? So I just think that there is an opportunity in this moment for us to have a different kind of equity conversation versus the traditional equity conversation. And that's what I heard King doing. Like that to me was the vision he was attempting to cast, but he was killed before he was able to fully walk that out. And there wasn't anyone with his gravitas that was able, to your point, pick that up and mushroom that into a movement that was consistent for that moment. And so I would just ask, as we close out, as you think about King, because this is both personal and communal, if you think about his greatest legacy in this moment for you, that what his life meant, what his vision meant, what his voice meant, what do you think is the greatest legacy for you that he left, or in some cases, the most forgotten one that we need to pick up? So Chris, I'll start with you.
I think for me, the most powerful thing that resonates with me and his legacy is, I guess that the work goes on, and the struggle goes on. And I say that because every day I'm kind of reminded where I think I've made a step, but then I'm reminded I still got 2 more steps ahead. And that's in everything, where as much as I'm trying to be a positive individual, be committed, be successful, there's still more that I have to do in terms of giving back, bringing in other people, empowering other people, and so being supportive. So I guess for me, it's really that the work is just not done, and I have to continue to try to be as vigilant as a person, as a human being, in terms of doing right, not just as an executive, but within the corporate space that I work in, within the community space that I live in, to continue to motivate.
Beautiful, beautiful. Andrea?
I think the biggest part of Dr. King's legacy that will always live on is resiliency. You know, there were a lot of no's that we know about, and I'm sure tons that we have yet to even read about in the books that he encountered, that members of his team encountered. And whether doing this work in the boardroom or doing this work in more of a grassroots format, I think it's so important to remain vigilant and to stay resilient, because no's mean not now. You know, it's not a forever no, it's not a permanent no. And I think so long as you're continuing to educate, evolve, pivot where necessary, to the point we discussed earlier about knowing your lane and then finding those who are in other lanes to collaborate and work alongside you and work with you and to lead you, in various capacities. I think it's so important to continue to remain a lifetime student. We never know everything. There's always more to learn. There's always more to change. And something that someone that I previously worked with always told me was to be confident in what you know and humble in what you don't know. And always look to learn and strengthen the areas where you see that you can really add value in advancing this work.
Awesome, thank you. Maurice?
Yeah, I would say the thing that resonates with me with King's legacy is what he said, these words: the time is always right to do what is right. I don't give a damn if it's profitable or not profitable. I'm not trying to convince you and twist your arm whether you're going to make something significant. The time is always right to do what's right. And I think that's what guides me and leads me, that whatever space I'm in, whoever I'm engaging with, whatever I'm pushing for, the time is always right to do what's right. And that's what I have to stay focused on. That's what I'm committed to. And that's what I'm going to keep moving forward with, man, that justice in the end will have the final say. And I want to be on the right side of that. And the time is always right to do right.
I would say what sticks with me the most is his drum major instinct speech at the end, where he says, where he talks about what he want his funeral to look like, and that he didn't want anybody to mention that he was the youngest person to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, or that the age he was when he got his PhD, or all of the honors that were received. And it was that moment where he actually fused in music with his message. And he talked about the Mahalia Jackson song where he says, listen, I just want people to remember I was a servant, and that if I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer someone with a word or a song, then my living would not be in vain. And all that is love. And I want my community to have power. I want them to have money. I want them to have resources. I want them to have what they're owed. I want them to have what they work for. I want corporations to pragmatically partner and engage with our communities in a way that I think King and so many others fought for. But I want love. And in a time where we have so many leaders and voices and visions that are rooted in fear, love is actually the antidote to that. And so if you want to talk about a real vaccine, King understood that the vaccine of love can beat the virus of fear and hate. And that legacy, I think, will never be one that we can have enough of. And so with that, Brother Maurice, I love you, brother. I appreciate you for gathering us in this moment, for the work that each of you are doing, for Warner for being open to having this kind of conversation versus a typical rah-rah, I have a dream King discussion. And for you all for leaning into it. And for every single person that's watching, that's a part of this incredible corporation, I think that you all have an amazing opportunity to make DEI part of your DNA in a way that others are just making it a part of their narrative. That's how you know when you're celebrating the legacy of King, not by what you say, but by what you create. So with that, you all have an amazing King Day, lead into Black History Month, learn, share, give, but most important, be excited about your ignorance. Because the moment you're excited about your ignorance, there is no limit on what you can learn. Thank you all so much.